Hello, 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 everyone. So happy to see you here today, and welcome to Tech Leaders Hub. Really excited to be doing this for you today. Hi to everyone watching and listening live. Hello to everyone watching and listening to the recording. Glad to have you all here paying attention to our little stream. My guest today is Matt Greenberg, CTO at Reforge. Matt, how are you doing today?
I'm doing wonderful. How are you?
I'm doing pretty fine, yeah. All things considered, I'm very happy to be doing this stream with you today. We've had to reschedule it once, but all good things come to those who wait. So I've been eagerly awaiting for us to have this conversation.
Waiting is not easy, so I appreciate
Yeah,
the
that's what I
patience.
always say, every time before I get on with a guest, I'm like, okay, the hard part is over, the wait is over, and now we get to have fun. And you get to have fun with us, dear watchers and listeners. But by the way, if you can hear us and you can see us, we would really appreciate a comment. So you let us know that everything is working on a technical level. We wouldn't want any problems with the audio or video, but most importantly, the audio to interfere with you enjoying Tech Leaders Hub today. And Matt, with what we've got to discuss today, we're going to be talking about a variety of topics, right? But the main kind of theme that we picked is how to get in the room and drive this company-wide change as a CTO. So, who do you think will benefit the most to listening to our conversation? Probably CTOs, but in what kind of situation?
And not even just CTOs. I mean, honestly, I think most of the skills that we leverage in our career are not things that we just learn one day and go
Mm,
forward. They're kind of like life skills. So, like the same
yeah.
thing that got your friends to a movie on time when you were in high school, or like convinced your lazy friend to get out of bed and go do a fun thing with you, or those are like the same foundational skills we use as leaders today. And some people have been practicing them for like 30, 40 years, and other people are kind of just starting because of their career. So
Okay.
I do think that, you know, most of this stuff is applicable to like line level software engineers, managers, directors, and you just have to start now so that by the time you're in this position, you're sort of like not at the bottom of a death spiral that you've sort of built for yourself.
Okay, yeah. I like you mentioning the death spiral, and definitely we'll get into that. So I find it very curious. What would you call this kind of skill of moving people? Because I just find it very curious. How do you think it also applies to the conversation here, getting people to go to the cinema with you?
Well, I mean, a lot of times, let's say, for example, as leaders, we use our influence skills. So,
Ah,
like,
yeah.
how is that different between, convincing your sibling what TV show to watch as is like convincing your peer what product idea to push on? They're like the
Right.
same fundamental concept. They just happen over time. Or recruiting people for your football team is not all that different from, like recruiting software engineers to your current team. And a lot of that same stuff is just still like we're all still human. So we look for those foundational skills. And we think about a lot of these things as talents, and I think there's like some element of that. But really, I think in many ways what we're talking about is just skills that have been developed for a very, very long period of time. So if you've never been an organized person and suddenly you have to put together a project plan for 100 engineers, you're
Yeah.
going to really, really, really struggle. But if you've spent your entire life putting together variations of a project plan and decomposing problems in a certain way, you're going to jump into that thing. And it might look like a talent to others, but to you, you've sort of been practicing for a really long period of time.
Yeah, exactly. When I'm analyzing my own kind of life and career, I often get that feeling, I try something like streaming, for example. I did not have a lot of experience with it when I was just starting out, but it went pretty well enough for SDX Next to let me continue doing this. And some people were saying it's talent. I just thought transferable skills, from stuff that I learned previously in life. And then a lot of it, when people say that you've got a certain talent, is just tons and tons and tons of practice that nobody ever saw, right? And that's yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was actually just talking to someone this morning who was trying to figure out their next career journey. And one of
Uh-huh.
the things I talk to people a lot is like it's super useful to cheat with adjacencies. Like, what
Huh.
competitive advantage do you have over someone else when you're considering your next role? And they're like, well, I don't really want to work on the exact same thing. I'm like, well, transferable skills aren't necessarily about doing the exact same thing. It's kind of decomposing the skills that you develop in this organization to understand what applicable skills you could bring to something else. So, if your company is a marketplace and you learn a lot about marketplace dynamics, then you can go to a very, very different marketplace and still be able to bring certain transferable skills with you. Or if tons of the work that you did was about activation, and you can like bring those things to a different mindset. In fact, I think that's how a lot of these like bottoms up SaaS companies came to fruition, is people with transferable skills realized they could take problems they had learned in one area in B2C and apply it to B2B and have a lot of success. And I think that's just what we often do again and again. So when you can take a new perspective to an existing business and leverage a transferable skill that no one else in the business has applied in a new way, that's really what innovation ends up being. And I think people want innovation to be some magic explosion of like new insight that could never have come from anything. But most of the innovation we end up doing is just transferable skills and taking a existing skill to a new problem in a new way, and it can look quite innovative.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, wow. Okay, so we already got into, what I usually say at the beginning is, okay, let's deliver some value up front. Here's a question to kind of drive you on that way. But we already started just mentioning a lot of applicable stuff. But anyway, so that's great. And I love that. And people in the comments are telling me they can see us and hear us fine. So I love to hear that too. Now, I do want to do what is a tradition at Tech Leaders Hub here, and despite us really starting with value up front just from the word go here, I do want to ask you the traditional Tech Leaders Hub question. So are you ready for it?
Probably.
Okay, so Matt, what is your number one tip for tech leaders?
Yeah, it's probably not just for tech leaders. It's likely for anybody in their career. But I think my number one tip is time is your career currency. And if you think about like a venture capitalist, they invest money and they're hoping for returns on that investment that are often like 10, 20, 50x what they put in. And I think as people who are working in a place where other people are making those sorts of long-term investments, instead of us investing our money in these companies, we're investing our time.
Yeah.
So I think savvy people are realizing that your time has like a really difficult opportunity cost. You can't replace it. 5 years at a bad company that's not helping you with like sort of mastery and motivation and moving your skill set and your capabilities to the next level, or generating outsized returns for you, I think is usually like a bad investment. And what you want to be doing is really holding a high bar for your time and thinking like a venture capitalist would. Like you wouldn't put your more money against a bad thing. So I think if you kind of start to think of your time as like your career currency, you start to think about what you're investing it in differently, and that can have a really profound impact for people in their career.
Do you think that might be the reason why people switch companies or maybe even career paths, is because they see that this time investment is starting to hit diminishing returns?
It better be.
Yeah,
I mean, that's the right way to think about it.
Yeah, seriously. Yeah, because I thought, first of all, it's a great tip, and what I'm always floored by is it's another unique tip. We've done over 20 of those now, and it's each time it's different. So yeah, it's a great kind of frame of mind to have in terms of how am I spending this time currency that you can't replace it, can't really get more of it easily. So you really have to think where you're thinking time, because a lot of people are thinking time currency in terms of, okay, how do I spend my week, but you're thinking in more long term in terms of how am I spending the years of my career, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about, we'll use the diminishing returns example. So I fundamentally believe, okay, for those who don't know, as you grow in your career, at each sort of iteration, there's a step function change in your compensation. So if you, I think people can think of careers having a lot of purpose, but like fundamentally, we're doing this to make money. That's why it's a career and a job and not like a hobby. We can also enjoy it, and there are other aspects to that, but if we all had enough money to survive, most of us would be choosing to do something different with our time. So if you think of the kind of output of your career as being like money to pay for things, the way to make the most money is to ascend to the very top and do it as quickly as possible. So if you spend, let's just say that between like the day you start your career and the age of 40, you kind of like grow the growth that you're going to do. And then after that, you sort of like stay kind of at that level for some period of time. I'm over 40, so I'll just say maybe it's higher than that, I hope. but call it 50, right? But
Okay.
you kind of end up taking that like 10, 15, 20 years past that in your career as sort of capitalizing whatever that is. So if you imagine at each of those tiers, you get a step function change in compensation, then if you sort of like add up the monetary output of different careers, people who make it to senior engineer versus staff engineer versus principal engineer have totally different outputs. And people who do it at companies that are successful versus unsuccessful have totally different outputs over that, like whatever 40-year career journey. So the thing that differentiates those things is basically like, how do you choose the companies you work at, and what mastery do you create along the way? Do you grow to the highest levels of your career? Now, there are obviously other ways you can think about your career, like work-life balance and things that you find joy in, and other sorts of outputs that you do. And those are totally valid. And if you're like a good scientist, you can assign some value to those things and
Weights
create an
even,
equation
right?
if you want. But
Yeah.
I think ultimately, if you're just thinking about it in the most simplistic way, the difference between someone who develops the skills to be a VP of engineering at a top tech company or a CTO at a top tech company, they're going to have a totally different monetary output from their career than someone who makes it to manager or senior manager, or stops at senior engineer versus staff engineer, or can do staff engineer at Google versus do staff engineer at a smaller company where the expectations are different. And what those differences compound. So that especially the first like 20 years of your career, if you're like sitting in a job that's giving you diminishing returns and developing mastery, then you're basically like lowering the ceiling of what your career can become, because you're wasting this like valuable career currency. So if you take two people, one of them's in a job that's basically too easy for them, they're like not growing and doing it, and one of it's in a job that's pushing them like crazy and they're learning a lot, then each successive role they take, there's going to be like differences in that step function. And it's going to start having like very different career returns. Similarly, someone who starts to think like a venture capitalist, understand how to evaluate companies, and takes 4 great swings in their career at great companies, maybe 1 or 2 of them hit, has a totally different outcome than someone who's working at companies that kind of like don't create compounding impact for you. Like equity is a really big and important lever for you having nonlinear returns in what you make from a compensation perspective in your career.
All right. Yeah. So already that, I think if somebody's watching or listening and are thinking, oh gosh, I've hit those diminishing returns, it might be already a wake-up call for them. I wanted to unpack one phrase here, and I'm sorry, Matt, some of us among here are marketers, like me, for example. Could you very briefly explain step function change to me? Like, what does that mean? What does that look like?
Yeah, sure. So oftentimes people think of things that are what we call like linear, which means like at each time they grow, they kind of grow in a line. And that, so if you make like a 1% improvement, you get a 1% return.
Yeah.
But what starts to really move things in companies is when you're going like this, and then there's like a bump. And that bump is like unreasonable. And then that's called a step function change. So instead of it looking like a line going up and to the right, it's like a line with a stair in it. And those stairs can kind of like really leap you forward. So, like if you think about my own career journey, I worked for a small startup right out of school as a software engineer. And I enjoyed it. It was like a fun company. And then we got bought by a big defense contractor here in the United States called Lockheed Martin. And I don't mean to be insulting to anyone here who works for Lockheed Martin, but they did not incentivize career growth. They were this like large bureaucratic engine that didn't want to fail. But when you don't want to fail, you put a lot of bureaucracy in place to guarantee some minimum return. But that bureaucracy also prevents emergent behavior that creates bigger return. So like in order to limit your downside, you limit your upside. So a lot of people
makes
would
these
stay
big
in those
swings impossible, basically.
It makes the big swings impossible. So you end up in these scenarios where they like, don't want a kid to come up with an idea and push it and like change the plan, even if the plan could be way better, because they're like really incentivized to try and just hit the plan, even if the plan as you're executing becomes not smart anymore. But it's like what they committed to do, they're going to go do it. So I spent 2 years there, and it was really bad for me. And the reason it was really bad for me is I didn't need to try very hard to be considered a high performer. And there weren't people there pushing me. There weren't projects there pushing me. I could honestly work like 4 hours a day and still be considered a high performer in their environment. And those 2 years compared to my friends who were in environments where they had mentorship, they had aspiration, they were pushing. All of a sudden I came out of that time and I was looking at people who I thought were my equivalent, but they had a step function difference in their career from where I was.
Okay.
They were getting looked at for opportunities that I wasn't getting looked at for. And I realized I had made a pretty big mistake in the time that I was there. And I hadn't realized how much that opportunity had cost me. And I sort of vowed never to do that again. Of course, I've made a few other like those sorts of mistakes over time. And shortly after that, I ended up at a company called Coso. It was really great. I got my first managerial job. I became the VP of engineering there. But the company had done well and then started to not do so well anymore. And there were a lot of decisions we made that weren't great decisions. But I probably stayed there 2 years too long also. And I had opportunities to start doing other fun stuff that would have pushed me. And I was getting diminishing returns in my own growth and learning some bad lessons. And I think I wanted it to be different. And I wasn't taking, because when you're in your own story, it's sometimes hard to evaluate it. And I needed to really take a step back to realize I was wasting away. I wasn't happy. I wasn't doing the best work of my career. And that was having diminishing returns for me in a pretty significant way. So then you want to try it again, right? Different try. And so each successive time you try and learn from the mistakes that you have. And then that time I realized that working at a company that's growing has a really significant positive impact in the opportunities that you're presented with. So when I was leaving Coso, I looked at a lot of different opportunities and picked Credit Karma, even though it was kind of the worst individual job opportunity I got. It was the best company, and I fundamentally believed in myself. And I felt like if I'm at a company that's growing, it's going to be filled with opportunities, and I'm going to capture those opportunities. So I didn't join as a VP of engineering there, but I grew into tackling that role. And then I got to, see that successful journey. And then it just, each time it changes the output and the outcomes that you get to be in. Leaving Credit Karma as a VP of engineering, especially for the international audience, that's a US primarily based fintech, but they sold to Intuit for $8 billion just a few years ago. So getting to see that company grow from 200 people to 1,500 people, from 100 million in revenue to $1 billion in revenue, like those sorts of things are really meaningful opportunities. And then your career changes again. Like all of a sudden new doors are open, new things can happen. So each of those things ends up being putting yourself in a position to capitalize on the opportunity that is in front of you. The better the environment, the better the return for you.
Yeah. So what I love about this is we just discussed, don't waste your career currency, don't hit diminishing returns, don't lower the ceiling of your career. And you're mentioning all of this because it meshes with your story. And these are kind of hard-earned lessons from how your career progressed. So I love that. And I love that additional context that you just gave us. So before we move on to kind of the main topic of the conversation, although I am loving all of the advice you're giving thus far, to be honest, to be completely open with you. I wanted to ask about Reforge, obviously, and about, how you ended up as CTO there, what's the business, what's your role, and, how are you kind of looking at yourself now in your role?
Yeah, it's interesting. Throughout my career, I often told my partner that I loved working in tech and it was really fun, but if I had a choice, like I would retire and become a teacher. And that was the thing that made me really happy. And when I often think that the way that your skills array, like as an entry-level person, you kind of need to do everything a minimum amount. And then the more senior you get, the less that it's like every skill is the same. And the more you kind of have this like sine wave of there are some things you're great at, there are some things you're bad at, and there are some things you're okay at.
Yeah.
But it's kind of like your impact is a measure of the average of all of those skills and how you leverage them. So the more and more you grow in your career, the more it becomes about taking the the like expertise that you have and making it even stronger, like more meaningful, and then sanding down your sharpest edges, so that they're not like cutting you and cutting others around you as you do that. And then Bernard, I love that note by Nikhil, and we work together at Credit Karma, so we have a lot of the same vocabulary for some of this stuff.
Okay, wait, let me pull that up then, because some people are gonna listening to the podcast version of this, so let me read that out loud, bring it up. Thanks for bringing it to my attention. So Bernard is saying that Nikhil Singhal, and I'm sorry for butchering the name just in advance, has written an excellent blog post about this and other topics. The title is "When Do You Know It's Time to Leave?" So you can look at the show notes to find that later. Though most of the other posts on the blog are of extremely high quality. You say you work together.
Yeah. Nikhil was the chief product officer at Credit Karma for most of my time while I was there.
Okay.
So VP of engineering, chief product officer, you spend a lot of time together, talk about your career learnings. Argue about
thanks
how we should
for
do
bringing
stuff,
that up,
that sort of
Bernard.
thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, and then when I was leaving Credit Karma, one of the things I had seen there was, as these companies are growing, am I allowed to swear? I don't know, is that okay? But like companies that we work at, they're kind of all fucked up, and everyone thinks that, oh, our company is fucked up, but all of these other companies are doing it perfectly, and that's why we're losing. And you think Google or Facebook or whatever, like that their shit doesn't stink, but it stinks. Every company is fucked up, and they all make a lot of mistakes along the way. And what happens is internally, you often have this self-doubt, like, I'm going to tackle this thing, but I don't know how to do it. I wish we could do it like that other company that does it perfectly. But so much of what we're trying to do is and what leaves is like, I don't know if people have felt this before, but where you're like, well, we have to hire the person who knows how to do this because we don't know how to do it. Well, when these companies are scaling and you double the number of jobs that you have and the roles that are open, someone internally has to step into those roles. And there's a bunch of like global SVPs at Facebook who were like interns at Facebook 10 years ago. And they just grew with the company, and they took an opportunity and they proved they could do it. And they took an opportunity and they proved they could do it. And it happens again and again. And for a company like Facebook or Google, it would be impossible to hire an SVP who's done it before because no one had done it before. And even today, when you're like trying to hire some of those roles, like no one's done exactly what you do and exactly the way you do it. It's like somebody is going to be batting out of position in some way to do it. So you have to kind of have the audacity to step into those roles and see if it works, if you can grow into it or not. But what helps is some form of professional development. So most of these companies have like large budgets for professional development. At Reforge, at Credit Karma, we had $5,000 per person. And I had this team of about 250 engineers, and they weren't spending that money. And maybe 30% of that budget got spent. And it wasn't because people didn't want to grow. It was because they literally had nothing valuable to spend it on. They would like go to a conference, but that was more a vacation than it was like valuable career learnings. And most of these insights just hadn't been synthesized yet. But people really want to know, you mentioned it earlier, I have earned insights from my career, ways that I've screwed up, and then like reapplied those learnings in a new way and be like, oh, I learned something, that are hard to just teach. And product management, engineering, tech is like a young career. This isn't carpentry or being an electrician where they've had hundreds or thousands of years to like hone those skills. We honestly have no idea what we're doing still in the scheme of things. Like these are incredibly young industries. So like no one's turned the best of product management or the best of engineering into a book, and it's still evolving because we're still learning as we go. So the best way to learn is to be with people who have those hard-earned insights and then do it 10% better and 10% better until we hone them into like real knowledge that can be done.
And it's almost like, I have a feeling it's almost like you owe it to yourself and you owe it to the industry, if you want to push the industry forward, to find the people who have these, like you said, hard-earned insights, to actually find out what is the cutting edge, and only then try to push it forward. Because I think what a lot of professionals are doing is they're like retreading the same mistakes that have been made without the proper training, and they're not actually pushing the envelope where they could be.
Yeah, and if you want to, if you think about the amount of energy a company has to expel, solving solved problems is way less good than solving as yet unsolved problems, because that's where the innovation lies. So if you're spending your time solving a problem that you could solve in a much simpler way with some support or some other way, this is also why like buy versus build is often really difficult for companies, because I think internally we feel like we could just build it better. But if that's not your like highest leverage thing to build, then a lot of times you probably shouldn't. Even though buying is not free either, it's still, if it's not the thing that's going to be the reason you win, you want to dedicate as much of your energy as humanly possible to the thing that's going to cause you to win. Anyway, we keep diverging. I decided to pick Reforge as my next opportunity because they're basically, at the time especially, we're kind of looking at as reinventing the MBA program and really taking an opportunity to take these hard-earned insights of frontier leaders in product engineering, marketing, and make them available to a community and a network that starts to grow. And I think that's where a lot of MBA started, is take these business learnings and give them to school versus like take academic learnings and give them to school. But they didn't update it with the tech industry. They like didn't leverage the network in meaningful ways. And I think there's a lot of ways that we can start to build that. So we're going to build this like next generation of a professional network, starting with like learning and development as our first opportunity.
Awesome. That sounds like very important work to be doing. I wanted to highlight one comment that came in, also from Bernard, sharing more resources and making sure this is an even more valuable Tech Leaders Hub session. So thanks, Bernard. One more top resource on engineering leadership, nominally one of the most subscribed Substacks of all time. It's called The Pragmatic Engineer by, another interesting name, Gergely Oros. I mean, in Polish, you would read it as Orosz, but I'm sure that's not the way it's usually pronounced.
I think he might be Polish, but I do. Here, this is a hot take. I think that one of the things that's really valuable about people who have really lived it is there's what makes someone a good, like kind of like the Instagramification of tech insight. It's like you can have distribution, you can be a good writer, and you can have good insights. You don't necessarily have to have all three. So someone like Nikhil, who's worked at Google, worked at Credit Karma, worked at Facebook, founded his own companies, who's like been in it, he has some really hard-earned insights from those experiences because he's tried to apply the things that he's talking about. And I think there are a lot of people out there who haven't had those same things and are kind of like speaking in a way that engineers want to hear. And I often find that like those insights are kind of like lacking a little bit. And I notice commonly in kind of this ecosystem, to me, some of the most valuable work is when someone takes a commonly held misconception and really challenges it, because a lot of times when I'm reading these articles, I'm like, hey, these people haven't lived this experience and they're saying something that sounds good, but it's probably not really true to those of us who have done it.
Yeah, LinkedIn is filled with those insights, don't you think? It's like
filled with it. Twitter, you're just sort of like, you're good at writing this thing, but you actually haven't done it, have you? Because those of us who have really done it, like know what's there. And just continuing on the hot takes, like Agile is great when you're thinking of one team, but it completely breaks when you start working with multiple teams. And there is no successful scaled company that I've ever seen that does like any of the scaled Agile frameworks. But the people who are pitching and peddling that stuff, they've never done it. Ever. It's like never been applied at scale. So you want to like, because when you look at a company like Google, they're using Google Sheets to manage their projects. They're not using some scaled Agile framework. And people don't know that, but there are a lot of people pontificate about it.
Yeah, that's true. And I would love to delve more into that, but I do feel like at this point, maybe we should start thinking also about the kind of the general topic of the session here. Because it's like we covered a huge variety of various topics, and I think all of it was valuable. Now, given your hard-earned insight, I do want to get into, getting into the room, and also this kind of tale of the CTO who wants to drive company-wide change. But by the way, watchers and listeners, if you're curious about anything else that Matt touched upon, leave a comment, and you will cast a magic spell on me, forcing me to read it out loud and to delve into that as well, because I want you to also make use of Matt's time here, which he has graciously granted us. So with that in mind, let's delve a little bit into the topic of driving change as a CTO, because I feel like, with all you've got to share here, this is something that could be very valuable. And it's also kind of stems to, the conversation we had before the live stream. We kind of touched upon this and we thought this is the thing that we should focus on. So I wanted to ask you, and this goes also back to the death spiral that you mentioned, so maybe we can start there, about the typical scenario. You're CTO and you think have a high position in a company, but then it turns out you're not involved in certain decisions, you're not kind of getting through. Tell us about the situation, how it usually develops, where it stems from, does the problem look like here?
I mean, I don't really think it starts as a CTO. I think it starts as an engineer. And
I see.
There's aspects of software engineering that are really hard. But I think sometimes we make it sound harder than it is. And in practice, I think most of the hard part is working with people and not so much actually like writing the code, which is hard in its own right, but different. But because we think of it as hard and because it gets so much of our time and attention, when you start your career as an engineer, your main focus is how do we do this? Not what do we do, not why are we doing it. Those things have often been figured out for you. It's how do we get this done? And often it's even like a focus on the technical how. And it takes so much of our executive function to just get through that technical how that we often have to ignore those other things. And as we grow in our career, because that's so much of our focus, we don't take the time and attention to stay out of those things. So like a commonly held thing that you hear in engineering is, I have too many meetings. I can't get this deep work done.
Yeah.
And because I have too many meetings, I'm trying to skip all these other things. Well, what are those other things that you're skipping? It's context building on what's and whys, and opportunity to be in the room for those things. So if you skip all that stuff early in your career, and then suddenly you're an engineering manager and you have to start being involved in those things, but the equivalent of like an associate PM is spending all of their time there, there's a step function change in their skills and practice from your skills and practice. So yes, you're going to be able to bring the how to all of those conversations, but even if you think you might have good what and why skills, if you haven't been practicing them for the first 5, 6, 7 years of your career, and they just have more repetitions. So what ends up happening to those engineers who are brought into those rooms is they continue to focus on the how, because it's the thing that they're the highest leverage. So what you'll see like a PM and a designer, and they'll say, well, we should do this or this or this. And then the engineering leader says, nope, we can't do that. We can't do that. We can't do that. And here are the 5 reasons why.
Yeah.
Well, if you're trying to be like generative and creative and you have someone else on the other side of the room who's just saying no to everything, like telling you why it's going to fail, that's not fun. So then those people take your execution mindset and they section it off and they say, great, well, we'll come up with a bunch of ideas and then you'll figure out how to do them. And you start to build this execution reputation. And then what that eventually leads to as you continue to scale is exclusion from the room. And the differences compound, because if you're not included as an eng manager, you don't start developing those skills. Those are long learned skills. By the time you're a director, you're not developing those skills. By the time you're a VP, you're not going to develop those skills. By the time you're a CTO, you're not going to develop those skills. And in a lot of cases, you actually just won't get those roles, because those roles are more and more often going to go to the engineering leaders who develop those skills, who can talk to those ideas, who can participate in those conversations, because they're going to be really high leverage. So you're going to say, well, my technical work is better than this other person, but they're being promoted to director and I'm not. And like, they're always agreeing to these things that I don't agree with, or making these decisions that I don't think are smart. And you kind of like in these death spirals, you don't see that you're in them. And all of a sudden you're on the outside looking in and you feel like it's unfair and it doesn't make sense. And the reality is it's all about you, and you have to climb yourself back out of it. And what that comes down to is like understanding what a healthy portfolio looks like, being calibrated between technology and strategy, crossing the decision-making canyon about understanding how, like, when to be generative, when to synthesize, and how to make savvy trade-offs, and then having a model for strategic execution between not just your portfolio, but knowing how your teams can execute with like high iteration, follow kind of like the Boyd's law mentality, and having an
Okay.
execution system that delivers what the company wants while still maintaining system health.
Okay.
All of those trade-offs come from a really deep understanding of the why. So if you're like a line engineer and you're getting Jira tickets and you're never asking questions, but you're just doing the work, you're starting that death spiral already. And if you're starting your skills more understanding, like a deep understanding of the what and why at that scale, but being able to do some of the how that no one else in the room can do, and you think of your high leverage as how do I bring better how to why and what, then what you're doing is never taking the death spiral in the first place. And it's way easier to fix these problems then. And you can then like rocket up through your career to the highest levels in that company.
Okay. So I feel like we should unpack these what, why, and how questions, because I think it would be great if you could make these a little bit more concrete and give some, examples of, okay, so when let's start with, the space you don't want to be in. So focusing on just the how questions. So the how questions, what do they usually look like? Is it specific, like, what architecture do we use? What tools do we use? If you could give a little bit more detail here, that would be super useful.
Yeah. I mean, it's like right now we're working on some new product innovation for Reforge. And fundamentally in doing that, there are going to be a number of technology problems we're going to have to solve. But the most fundamental thing starts with, why are we working on the innovation in the first place? What business problems are we trying to solve? What's like the rubric in which we're making the decisions we're making? Why is that the rubric? How is it that we view like market and competitive landscape such that we think we should be working on things, the dynamics of the company? Because each of those decisions ladders up to like the smaller decisions we end up making. So,
so
let's imagine
those are
this
the why
scenario.
questions, basically.
Yeah, well, let's imagine this scenario that you and I have exactly the same context and exactly the same priorities. Then if we're given some new piece of information, we should both make exactly the same decision. Does that make sense? Like if we have the same rubric for a decision and we have the same context, given a new input, we should make the same decision.
Yeah.
A lot of times when people disagree, it's because they're missing context or their rubrics are misaligned. So if you think about what you're doing at the beginning, like really fundamentally understanding the why, is you're trying to make sure you have all of the context and that you understand and can influence the rubric. And that's a lot of what we end up talking about, because you still want everyone to make the same decision. But if you have a perspective, you can add it to that and change the rubrics. So like, for example, if a company is trying to solve a retention issue, so you're like a B2B subscription and folks are leaving the company after like on a monthly basis, a higher churn rate than you want. There are a lot of ways that you can solve that problem. You can solve it by having like a bunch of campaigns to try and keep people from churning, having better payment processing at the churn stage, and make sure that you're like saving people's credit cards so that there's like less friction in renewal. Or if it's invoicing, you have a better like invoicing system, or people are contacting support who otherwise wouldn't. You can like lower friction to prevent churn. You can also add friction to prevent churn. You can make it so you can only churn if you call our customer support number and it's like obfuscated somewhere and people are having a bad experience. There's all sorts of different ways you can solve that. You can also go all the way back to the beginning and work on activation. And you can say, churn happens because we never got these users to really love the product in the first place. And we have to get more users to love the product up front. And then when it comes to churn, we'll have a lot less churn because people don't churn from a product they love. Or you might say like somewhere in the middle, we're just having people fall off, right? Maybe it's like Peloton. And every time you go on a vacation, you like don't restart your Peloton activity. You love it, love it, love it. But as soon as you fall out of habit, you have to like, there's a lot of activation energy there. So which of those ways do you solve this problem? That's the what. Which one of these things should we do to solve the problem of churn? And it comes back to the why. Why do I think there's churn in the first place? What like hypotheses do I have about these different pieces of what we end up doing? How do we think about these approaches and stuff like that? And when you have the what's and the whys and you are there in the room for them and you understand them, then when you come to a how, you might be able to say something like, well, here's a way I think we could personalize retention messaging that would have a lot of impact using a technology lever that no one else in the room could see. But if you're pitching that idea and the company direction is really to work on activation, then your idea feels like it's coming out of left field. So if you're looking at a how and you're like, oh, we can use machine learning to solve this problem, but everyone's like, oh, you're thinking about the problem wrong because you have the wrong strategic context and calibration,
Exactly.
then they're never going to listen to your idea. So the hows end up being more like, hey, we're going to do personalizations. Here's where you can look at it. Here's what this comes down to. You go execute it and you're like, hey, personalization is really hard. We need these other features in order to do it. You know, you're thinking about the problem wrong. I wish you had included me a month ago so I could tell you that this was the wrong path to take because the what had already been decided. The way you get in that room is that you can be a productive member of the first conversation.
Okay. So trying to kind of boil it down and put it all together, it all starts with asking these questions of, okay, you're asking me to build X, but what business problem are you trying to solve with X? What are the alternative ways to solve this problem? And what is actually causing this problem that we could address instead? Kind of going up the chain of events here.
And ultimately, where you want to be able to get to is that you can influence that rubric and that why. And you're in the room at that stage, and you also know how to have that conversation in a way where you can be productive. And the leverage you have as a technology leader is your understanding of the how. So if someone has read a cool blog post about VR and thinks that your company should be adapting some VR thing, and you're like, hey, that's like 2 years of work for us, you know, this thing isn't there, this makes no sense. If you're not in the room to head that off, it doesn't go there. But you also don't just say no to it. You start to say, well, here are the things we can do. How do you become an enabler in that conversation?
Yeah, exactly. And you know, because I'm thinking, you know, when you're in the death spiral, I see the CTO as this kind of the person who shoots down ideas. But when you have this additional context of what we're trying to achieve and why, it's like this idea may not be feasible technically, but given what we want to achieve and why we want to achieve that, here are some alternatives, right? But if you only get the ideas of things to build and you say no to them, it's no wonder that you get left out of the room.
And the reality is sometimes you have to be willing to try too. And you have to know when is it appropriate to put all that investment in. Or even better, if you see the direction of the company is moving that way, laying a few bricks early that give you a foundation so that you can jump to do those things is real like strategic technology, execution, and strategy. So you're saying, hey, I think the company is going to need to use machine learning or going to need to be in VR. And how can I start to like lay a few foundational elements so that when we do make that decision, it goes from this is a 24-month task to actually, I think we can get there in 9 months. I think we can get there in 3 months because we've done a few of the other things that allow us to start to like leave that door open versus kind of like having that door closed when we get there.
Okay, yeah, all right. Thanks for that. Bernard, we are seeing your comments, leaving some additional resources in the comments section there. It'll take us a while to kind of explore that, so I'll leave that to the watchers and listeners to explore after the session. But thank you for leaving the links and enriching our session. Thank you so much for that. So, in terms of kind of getting yourself out of that death spiral, at some point a few minutes ago, you mentioned some of these kind of phrases that I wanted to get back to in terms of things that you can actually do. There was closing a leadership gap, I think, and a few others. So could you maybe start unpacking that for our audience, you know, and of those, which one do you think is the kind of highest leverage step to take? If somebody's listening to this thinking, oh gosh, I've been this person shooting down ideas, not getting to the what and the why, where do they start fixing that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of it comes down to going and educating yourself on those things and sort of your orientation for how you approach the problem. So if we think about how do you calibrate to what you want to do, I think a lot of it comes down to first realizing what role you're operating on in the room. So people often talk about product engineering and design as being like in the box together. On every different company and every different team, oftentimes those roles can have some pretty blurry lines about it. Who does this? Who does that? Should this be product? Should this be engineering? Should this be design? It kind of doesn't matter as long as that group as a unit for any given project operates as a black box to the rest of the organization. It's like, who puts the tickets in Jira, who makes this decision, who makes that decision, kind of doesn't matter as long as they all happen. And as you're a leader cross-functionally trying to compose these teams together, you want to make sure that they have the right matching skill sets to do that work. So when you think about those things and you basically say like, well, actually my contribution to this team can be anything, there's a few things it has to be. How do I make sure that I'm open to those conversations and I make time for them and I prioritize them? That's like your starting point. So, and then a lot of it comes down seeking to learn. So we say in America, shit rolls downhill. And oftentimes engineering, maybe QA might say, like they're like one of the last people in the pipeline. So
they're at the bottom of the hill.
They're at the bottom of the hill. So what you really want to do is get yourself up to the top of the hill so that you can like redirect things so that by the time it rolls all the way down, it's actually not so bad. And it's really hard when, you know, your CEO conceives of a project, some like strategic leader gets involved with it and they make a bunch of commitments and they sell it to some customers on the sales side. And then it comes to you in engineering and they say, we need you to make this real in 2 months. And it's impossible. So, but what you have to do is just recognize people just say like, well, I should be in the room. The team should make the decision to get me there. I think the second orientation I would have is like, you have to earn your way into the room. So there's what the really popular play Hamilton is like what happens in the room. Like you want to get into the room, you want to be in that room. No one in tech really says like, you know what, we should find all of the right people and bring them into the room. Like that's not how it works. They try and keep the room pretty small. You have to like earn your way. You have to beat the door down to get into it. You need to be the one who is necessary to be in that conversation. And the way that you do that is you provide really valuable contribution. So it starts with, if you have that reputation today, doing some steps to erase that reputation. First, I would say seek to understand. If someone says something that you disagree with, it's really hard to disagree and commit to something that you both disagree with and don't understand their perspective. So you have to start by assuming positive intent. Explain to me why you have this idea, instead of saying, here's why that idea doesn't work. And you want to understand, why do they think it's important? And ultimately what you're trying to do is build context and understand the existing organizational rubric. And recognizing that you don't necessarily have the ability to change something that you don't understand. And if all of your ideas are getting shot down, it's probably because you're not approaching it from the perspective of the rubric and like what you want to change with it. So you want to say like, understand all the organizational context. So that's quantitative, qualitative, market, and competitive. So quantitative, what are the metrics of our business? What's our growth model? How does it work? What are the things that are high leverage? And having a set of heuristics that help you understand what are the things that move the needle for the company. Qualitative, talk to the actual customers, like understand the qualitative growth model, how the company believes it should be growing, how the company believes its users should be engaging with it, and then talk to some of those customers and see what you see. Market, you operate in a wide market context. There are like reasons that you want to occupy a space. Maybe existing players do something a certain way, and your company fundamentally believes it needs to be divergent from that in order to have operating runway to win and beat an existing competitor or something like that. And then competitive, which is slightly different from market, but like who are your competitors and why are they doing it the way that they're doing it? So you can be operating in the professional ed tech space. That's different from knowing who all the competitors are in the professional ed tech space. Who are you competing with for dollars and attention and eyes? How are they doing things? And what are they doing well? What are they doing poorly? And ultimately, if you need all of that context, and then with it, how is your company currently operating? What are they currently doing? What do we have the capabilities and systems to do? And what don't we have the capabilities and systems
and to latch on a piece of that, then, if I have, for example, the context of the competition and somebody's coming to me and saying, you know, for our product, we totally need to have VR in there, and you don't understand where it's coming from, it might turn out that, for example, all of the competition is doing it, you had no idea, and that's why this ask is coming to you. And then you can have a more informed conversation about that.
Right. So, and we can separate market from competitive by saying someone believes the market is going to a place where VR is going to be critical. So like a good example of that is Facebook's like mobile first initiative.
Mm-hmm.
They fundamentally believed that the market was moving in the direction that mobile was going to be a critical asset for everyone in that market at some point. Was there some competition they were copying? Not really yet, but they felt like that's where the market was going. A second version of that might be a bunch of other people seeing it working and realizing that if their competitors are there, if they're not also there, then their business won't be successful against them.
Mm-hmm.
So you might say, none of our competitors are in VR yet, but we think this whole ecosystem is going to go to VR. Therefore, we should go there first. A separate insight might be, everyone's in VR, that's where our customers are, and we're going to lose everyone to VR if we're not operating with our competition.
Okay.
So those are two different like mindsets for thinking of a similar like business context
Yeah.
calibration.
Yeah, and I suppose it goes even further than that, because I'm thinking, when I'm a CTO, if I take an interest in what the market is doing, what the competition is doing, I can also analyze it better than anybody else in the room on a technical level. And I can also bring that additional information there. Have you noticed that they're all doing microservices, for example, or, they have some certain technological solutions there that we should also be thinking about implementing?
Yeah, so if you think about your portfolio, it has like different types of work in it. Some of it's product work, some of it's enablement work, some of it's scale work, and some of it's risk work. So your product work is sort of like executing on the product market, getting the product to market, making it better as it goes. Risk work is sort of like making sure you don't get hacked, that the product doesn't crash, and there's like a set of like defensive things you have to do there. Scale work is, as you get more employees and you get more customers, you often need to improve your technology and your systems in order to grow. Enablement work is where a lot of that skill like really comes in as a CTO, because that's about like laying framework for future work. So if you are part of all of those competition, like competitive analyses, or you're part of all of those conversations, and you're saying like, I think we're going to be moving in the direction of mobile. We don't have a mobile app today, but we're probably going to need one. It's not a priority this year, but it'll be a priority next year. Then the way the hows get implemented, all of a sudden you might say to your team, like, okay, we should be abstracting all these endpoints to GraphQL, and you're building out this like middleware tier so that we can have an app and we can have a web presence. And the team might be like, that's crazy extra work for us because we don't have an app. We don't need to do those things. And you're kind of saying like, we should be putting in 20% more work on all of these things, because otherwise next year, when they tell us we have to do mobile, we won't be able to execute on it. And so from you as a leader, like a lot of times you're saying, hey, we have to be doing these things, and you try and explain it to the team, and they're like, well, we don't understand. We don't want to do this work. We don't kind of care about your reasonings. It's illogical to us. We're not there. You get that like friction. So you kind of want to be able to bring your team along. You want to be able to explain it to them. You want them to see what you see in the framework that you see it. And then all of a sudden these projects become really important. Whereas if you actually have no intent of doing mobile, you're trying to follow some trend because a competitor is doing it, maybe there's like some reason you wouldn't, then there's also a big opportunity cost that if you're enabling that and you're not, say, I don't know, enabling VR or something totally different like machine learning, then you're actually putting your like small number of bets that you get to make down on the wrong horse. So even if you think the company should be going mobile, but the CEO is clearly moving in the direction of machine learning enabled technology, but you're not building the right data lake and creating the right data quality systems and doing these other things that you need to be doing, then you're not enabling the strategic goals of the company. You're enabling your own goals as like an interested engineer, or like what you think might matter. But then what happens is those things become more and more divergent over time. So what you really want is these early stage blowups where you say like, we were moving in this direction, but I can sense that we're actually moving in this other direction. So I'm going to change things by degrees, so that a year from now, we are 10% closer to where the CEO wants to be instead of 10% further away. If you think about that over the context of like a 5-year journey at a company, the person who's making more and more of those 10% closer decisions, they've moved a lot farther. The way I often describe this to my team is I think most people in companies are sort of playing the role of commissioned artist. So if you I think everyone's like, oh, I want to be in the room. I want to make all the decisions. No one ever
Uh-huh.
really makes all the decisions. I don't make all the decisions, right? Like that's not how it works.
Okay.
What ends up happening is someone is commissioning art from you. So maybe you want, what they're going to do is give you some constraints. I want a portrait of my family. Here are some things I like. Here are some things I don't like. But if you give that to 1,000 artists, you get 1,000 different renditions. No two artists are
Yeah,
going
of
to make you
course.
the exact same things. But if you imagine in those 1,000 different renditions, regardless of what rubric you got as input, like from the person you've commissioned from, they're going to love some of them, like some of them, think some of them are okay, and hate some of them.
Hmm.
So the way that we operate with our strategic context, with the questions that we asked, with the understanding we have, you just want to veer more and more of the art that you get commissioned into art that people love. And then
Hmm.
each time you do it, you get more leeway with less constraints in the commissioning. So
Right.
maybe at the start, they'll say, I want these 50 things met. And you're like, okay, you can still have, you have a lot of leeway. You're the one with the paintbrush. You're like making those decisions. So if
Hmm.
you can keep repeatedly proving that you can produce great art and you start to understand more and more of the context, there's always things that aren't on the page that you're making decisions about, 1,000 little decisions. And you
Hmm.
just want to make each of them 1% better than someone else would make them. And
Right.
that impact compounds over time, but it all comes from what and why context. Almost none of it comes from how.
Yeah.
So like the the person with a really precise, perfect brushstrokes can make better art. But if they're doing it with the wrong what and why, it's always going to be something people hate.
Right. If they've asked
Comparatively,
fewer questions about what this client actually wants, it doesn't matter how great their brushstrokes are because it's not going to be a piece that they enjoy.
totally. So like another really tangible example is like I tell my teams that a good pull request is not just about the code. It's about looking at why we were doing it in the first place, the ticket, loading up the feature, trying it, and being like, did this accomplish the thing we were trying to accomplish?
Hmm.
The code being right is secondary. If the code is perfect, but it's doing the thing that doesn't satisfy the needs or the desires of why we were doing it in the first place, it was kind of bad. So
Right.
like, how do we get into the mindset of like building context with the designer, building context with the product manager, understanding like why they put the button where they put it, why they made it that color? Because when we're implementing things, oftentimes we're like, ooh, that's really, really hard. The flip side of that is they spend 3 extra weeks trying to figure out exactly how to get the button positioned perfectly. But the designer then says, like, well, it could have been 2 inches over and it would have been fine.
Yeah.
But if you don't understand why they put the button where it was and whether that was a big deal or it wasn't a big deal, you often end up going kind of in the wrong way at the wrong time in the wrong way. And those end up being these like late stage blowups on the micro scale for your work.
Hmm.
Whereas if you put time and attention into the things that are really high value, that stuff can really compound throughout the course of your career and your impact grows with it.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I love all of that. And sometimes, you spend so much time, and I've been there, thinking of a button, making sure it's positioned perfectly, or of a phrasing or something. And you never ask yourself, for example, what is the impact of this work actually? Is this a button that's going to be displayed 1 million times per week, or is it going to be seen just by 20 people who get this one particular email?
And they
So
don't care what the button is.
yeah, yeah, and they
Yeah.
might not even care what the button is because they're getting something that they want to click anyway. For example, sorry, Matt, I just wanted to ask: do we have a hard stop in 2 minutes?
Um, we have a hard stop soon. We have a soft stop in 2 minutes. How does that sound?
Okay, all right. So, despite the fact that I would love to ask more follow-up questions, let's leave. First of all, I mean, this was a great session. I loved all that you shared, and I feel like we
Oh,
just
thank you.
scratched the surface. So I wanted to first of all thank you for the contribution, and I want to ask before we run out of time if you have any announcements for the audience, anything you want to put out there. I want to give you the opportunity to do that before we log off.
Oh, yeah. I should probably talk about Reforge, which is just to say Reforge runs cohort-based programs on improving in your career, in your tech career. So if you're a product manager, marketer, or engineer, we have a bunch of programming around that. A lot of the stuff I talked about today comes from our technical leadership program, which is about like how to become a great technical leader and pull yourself out of the technology death spiral. We also have a program in scaling product delivery, which is about like how do you have more early stage blowups and less late stage blowups as you have more and more people working on projects. And you're commissioning art from 50 people at the same time, and you want it all to be cohesive. How do you think about doing that?
Yeah.
We have an engineering management program. Like, what does it look like to go from good to great as an engineering manager? And a variety of other things on the product and marketing side, especially growth, product marketing, product management, becoming a great product management leader. That's Reforge. And our spring cohort starts in a couple weeks. So you can go to www.reforge.com and apply today.
Yeah, love that. And honestly, all the great knowledge you shared today is, as much advertisement you need as you need for Reforge, and the value you can bring. So I really loved being kind of exposed to that. And on our end, if anybody's meeting STX Next for the first time through the stream, hi, very happy to have you here. Thanks for watching Tech Leaders Hub. STX Next, we're Europe's largest Python software development company. We specialize in Python. If you've got a product that you're building or wanting to build and want to build it faster and better, we've attracted some of the best talent in Poland: developers, designers, DevOps engineers, machine learning, data engineers, and more. So we can add that to your project in just a few weeks if you go to www.stxnext.com. For more Tech Leaders Hub, techleadershub.com. The best way to get informed about our sessions is by following STX Next on LinkedIn. That's where we focus the most on in terms of Tech Leaders Hub. There's a session coming up tomorrow, so you can grab that. You can go to the STX Next page on LinkedIn, and all the information is gonna be there. And somebody in the comments is saying, on a great note to end on, thank you, Matt. Great knowledge share. I do believe that user might be Uday Tiruvedula, and I'm getting really difficult names today. Anyway, thank you. And yes, I do agree. Great knowledge shared today. So thank you, Matt, for your time on Tech Leaders Hub. Thank you, watchers and listeners. And we'll see you tomorrow for the next session. For today, thanks a lot for being here.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. And hopefully we get to do something like this again.
Yeah, I would love that. For now, sadly, end broadcast. Bye.